The upcoming APEC leaders gathering here in South Korea this autumn may provide the setting of a sideline summit between the presidents of the US and China. We have more on Press Perspective today. Hello and welcome to Wednesday's edition of Press Perspective. It's July 23rd here in Seoul. I'm Min Sunhee. We are counting down 100 days to the start of this year's APEC Summit here in South Korea on October 31st. And already the upcoming multilateral gathering is making headlines. For more on this, I have Thomas Maresca with American news agency UPI here in the studio. Thomas, welcome back.
Thank you. Great to be here as always.
I also have Professor Kim Jae-chun at Sogang University joining our session virtually. Professor Kim, it's a pleasure to have you with us.
It's good to be here. Thank you.
Right, we will start here in the studio. Thomas, let's begin with details of the exclusive coverage by the South China Morning Post about a possible summit between the leaders of the US and China on the sidelines or around the APEC summit here in South Korea later this autumn.
Right, so there was a story in South China Morning Post, as you said. I saw something similar in Reuters, so I'm not sure how incredibly exclusive it is, but basically it sounds more like informed speculation than any idea that, you know, there's something definitive going to happen. I mean, we still don't even know actually if Trump is definitely coming to the APEC summit. It sounds like, you know, he intends to, or that seems to be the general belief. But basically the idea was that, you know, analysts and some unnamed sources close to Beijing and Washington are saying that, you know, kind of maybe the wheels are moving towards a potential summit between Trump and Xi, and the APEC meeting would be kind of the, you know, ideal time or would make the most sense, and it could be a sideline, you know, meeting at APEC, or it could also be ahead of, you know, if Trump could, on his way through Asia could go to China. So that's, you know, basically the outline of it. And then, you know, also it's based on the idea that there's, you know, there's been steps in motion. You can tell that both sides are kind of engaging. You know, it's not a few months ago when Trump started the whole sort of reciprocal tariff, you know, outline and really targeted China specifically. There was a lot of, you know, back and forth and raising of tariffs. But since then, you know, in June, they agreed on an extension and actually, you know, moved some pieces around. You know, like China agreed to start exporting rare earth minerals, and Trump and you know, Washington eased some export controls on AI chips. And then Rubio and the Chinese foreign minister met earlier this month, and they sort of had you know, it sounded like a reasonably positive meeting, and Rubio said there was a strong desire to set something up with Trump and Xi. So there's been a few things like that. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent actually just yesterday said there's going to be a meeting next week in Sweden to discuss extending these tariff negotiations further. So, you know, there's this idea that things are in motion, there's an interest on both sides, and so, you know, it would make sense if they were to meet. You know, APEC would be a good period, you know, although this SCMP article and a few other things I've read have also mentioned that, you know, China in a way is less urgent. It's less of an urgent thing for China. You know, there's this sense that Trump has more of a need to maybe set this, you know, to get something going, whereas China is taking this wait and see approach because there's so many other things going on with Trump's tariff schemes, and, you know, China might just want to sit back, or is maybe okay with sitting back and seeing what the fallout of all of this other turmoil is. So that's a little bit of that background as well.
Right then, Professor Kim, what would be the significance of such a summit between Mr. Trump and President Xi Jinping if it were to take place, and what might be on their agenda?
The summit between President Trump and President Xi, I think if it happens, it'll carry profound significance for several reasons. For one thing, there is geopolitical importance to the summit. You know, it's no secret that two countries are locked in deepening strategic competition, maybe for a long haul. And given the strong leadership style of two leaders, I mean, President Trump and President Xi, they are known to be very strong leaders. For that reason, many analysts worry that the relationship between the two countries could spiral out of control because two leaders, they appear that they seldom back down. They are rather inclined to sharp confrontation. In this sense, I think the summit could function as a vital guardrail, guardrail with which we can sort of prevent the competition from getting out of control. There is little doubt, as I said before, the strategic competition would continue for a long time to come. But it's also important for two countries maintain key communication channels and guardrails. I think the summit can play that role. And there is also a geo-economic significance to the summit because recently two countries were sort of embroiled in the worst ever trade war with each other. Although I believe the tension has scaled down to a certain extent after the Geneva meeting in last month. But still, there are so many pending issues such as trade imbalances, tariffs, technology control or technology transfer, and what have you, really. So the U.S. and China, the two biggest economies in the world, together they occupy some 45% or 46% of world's GDP, if my memory serves me correct. So the way they settle economic disputes will have sweeping economic implications for the rest of the world.
Right. And staying with possible summits, Thomas, should the Chinese leader visit South Korea or partake, that is, in the Apec summit in the city of Gyeongju, it will mark his first trip here in some 11 years, I believe. Now, during talks on the phone with Xi Jinping, President Lee Jae-myung underscored the importance of economy and security between the two countries. That being said, what do you suppose the prospects of more productive bilateral ties between the two countries under the Lee Jae-myung and Xi Jinping administrations? And in what areas might these two sides see some tangible progress, Thomas?
Well, as you said, they had a phone call shortly after Lee Jae-myung was elected president. And, you would think there are definitely areas you could see the relationship taking a step forward. I mean, just in general, Lee Jae-myung has already laid out this idea of a more pragmatic diplomacy. I wouldn't say conciliatory necessarily toward China, but being more open to communications across the board. Where and this is somewhat in contrast to his predecessor, President Yoon, and also the previous U.S. President Biden, where there really was more of a two sides taking shape, global blocks, liberal democracy versus authoritarianism kind of, framing was taking shape, and Yoon had very much, decided to cast his lot with Washington. I mean, as much as is possible. Obviously, you can't just kind of write off China as South Korea. I mean, China remains South Korea's biggest trade partner, and it's just an important major power right next door. So, there's some idea that, Lee Jae-myung would be kind of opening the door to that. And then I think also in terms of just what's going on with the overall trade environment, the sort of uncertainty and chaos that's been inserted into it in these recent months, just with the possible tariffs, and we don't know where trade is going to land on that. So there's some idea that just generally, not just South Korea, but countries in the world, and especially U.S. allies, also sort of have to look at how can we position ourselves, maybe not to be as closely allied with the U.S., or at least leaving open the door for engaging with China in different ways. And I think China is also aware of this opportunity in some areas. I mean, maybe the U.S. withdrawing from some of its aid projects around the world and things like that. China, you hear or read that China is certainly looking into those areas. So that whole landscape is changing, but it also coincides with, I think, Lee Jae-myung's inclination towards being more engaged. So we might see, other, one thing when you mentioned security too, Jae-myung, I think in his call mentioned wanting Beijing to perhaps help cooperate more on the North Korea issue and exert some influence on North Korea's growing nuclear and missile development. So that could be a potential area for some cooperation. We'll have to see where China, maybe decides North Korea is going too far or wants to impose its will. And then, there's obviously a lot of economic potential. At the same time, there still is globally, diversifying supply chains. There has been already a kind of decoupling or de-risking. So, those factors are maybe also going to have South Korea looking in other directions as well. So, those are some basic points where you might see potential for cooperation.
Right, for sure. Professor Kim, speaking of summits, officials here in the country are actively working to arrange a one-on-one between President Lee Jae-myung and his American counterpart, Donald Trump. What are your thoughts regarding these efforts to ensure a meeting in the near future? And Professor Kim, are you concerned perhaps about a potential Oval Office ambush, if you will, by Mr. Trump against his South Korean counterpart? And if one does occur, what might be the issue of contention, and how should President Lee Jae-myung seek to navigate such a potential scenario?
The summit between President Lee and President Trump is bound to take place sooner or later, but we don't know the exact timing. The exact timing of the summit remains very uncertain at this stage. South Korean government, the Lee Jae-myung government, is making considerable efforts to make it happen as soon as possible. Maybe preferably during August, but realistically, we may have to wait until September when the UN General Assembly convenes in New York. I'm pretty sure that a brief summit between President Lee and President Trump will take place on the sideline of UN General Assembly. Although this summit is going to be very brief in nature because it's going to take place on the sideline. Second meeting is also likely during the Apec summit in Gyeongju, South Korea, later this year, October this year to be more precise. But we have to wait and see whether Mr. Trump is coming to the venue, as Thomas just mentioned. As I said, an August summit remains a tough call, largely because the U.S. politics goes into recess during most of August. Before the Lee-Trump summit, I think it's important for South Korea to reach a win-win package deal with the United States before August the 1st, which is the expiration date of the reciprocal tariff grace period. If two countries can deliver a deal that is akin to the one between the United States and Japan that came out yesterday, I believe President Trump would be more receptive to holding an earlier summit ahead of the September UN General Assembly. If this deal between South Korea and the U.S. resonates with President Trump, I don't think we'll have to worry too much about potential Oval Office ambush. I think it's also important for President Lee to sort of dispel this perception, or misperception, if you will, that he's a pro-China politician before the summit takes place, and it's necessary to preempt potential Oval Office ambush.
Right, Professor. Meanwhile, Thomas, back on the upcoming APEC summit in Gyeongju this autumn, do tell us a bit about the agenda this year, including, of course, South Korea's plans to touch upon falling birth rates and aging societies, which are topics that are not traditionally addressed by the APEC forum, right?
Right, that's correct. Just very generally, as you mentioned, it's being held in Gyeongju. Some 20,000 participants are expected to come, which is including 3,500 delegates from 21 member countries. The theme has been announced. It's building a sustainable tomorrow, and the keywords, I mean, these are very just sort of, you hear these kind of generic sounding things: connect, innovate, prosper. But some of the officials involved with planning have kind of given some indications of what the key focus points that they want to hit upon are. And this idea that focusing on kind of economic integration and free trade, which is what APEC is about in a lot of ways, will be front and center. Strengthening the kind of multilateral trading system, and amid this era now of growing protectionism and fragmenting supply chains, so that's been what's sort of been indicated as a hope for bringing people to the table, or the participants to the table, and getting back to some of that, which will be an interesting thing to see how that plays out. Just seeing where we are 100 days from now in terms of the whole global tariff regime and the trade regime. So this could be a really significant subject at that time, and depending on who's attending as well. And they also mentioned highlights of focusing on digital transformation in the region, and AI in particular in South Korea, and this Lee Jae-myung administration has talked about AI being a real essential, focus going forward. So there's discussions about, there's plans to discuss cooperation for safe and inclusive AI, which is just another issue that is, so looming large in the future. And of course, like China and US have a lot to do with that. And then, as you mentioned briefly, South Korea had talked about wanting to bring up the question, or issues around declining birth rates and aging population, which of course are major things that South Korea right now is dealing with maybe in a more acute way than a lot of countries. But it is out there for all, especially developed countries, are all facing slowing birth rates, declining populations. Even China is as well, looming large. So obviously a topic that has resonance for the participants.
Right. Professor Kim, SK Group Chairman Choi Tae-won will be hosting the APEC CEO Summit this year. Now, speaking to members of the media, he recently proposed an EU-style economic bloc, including South Korea and Japan. What are your thoughts regarding such a regional bloc?
In theory, I believe Chairman Choi Tae-won's proposal makes a lot of sense. His proposal, in a nutshell, is that South Korea and Japan should establish, as you mentioned, an EU-like economic bloc. Why is that? Because the economies of two countries are grappling with similar problems, such as stagnant growth, aging populations, and rising, most importantly, rising global trade barriers. So if South Korea and Japan can somehow create an EU-like economic bloc, this is going to be at least $6 trillion economic zone, making it the fourth largest economy in the world. This in turn will place South Korea and Japan in a much better position to tackle shared geo-economic challenges. But that said, I'm not really sure whether this proposal is viable in terms of domestic politics. True that the current relationship between the two countries, South Korea and Japan, is in much better position than, say, 5 to 7 years ago, but still there are many hurdles that we need to cross before we fully mend fences with each other. Among many other things, there are long-standing historical grievances and territorial disputes over Dokdo Island. So given these realities, economic bloc is going to be a hard sell, in my personal opinion, in terms of domestic politics in both countries. But that said, as Chairman Choi mentioned, two countries need to be more forward-looking. Bilateral relationship with the U.S. has been the centerpiece of security and economic policies in both countries. But now the U.S. has become a very different country. And with the U.S. policy shifting, South Korea and Japan, I think we have to reach out to each other and deepen our ties, just as economic, European countries have reached out to each other and try to rely less on the United States recently. Not only that, I think it's also important for South Korea and Japan to reach out to European countries as well, so we can tackle shared global challenges down the road.
Right, right. Thomas, speaking as a foreign journalist based here in Seoul, are there any underreported, perhaps, aspects of South Korea's hosting of the APEC summit that you believe deserve more international attention?
Well, I think South Korea hosting it will bring South Korean foreign policy and this administration kind of into maybe a global spotlight, and it's a chance to show where South Korea is on the international stage, especially after this period of chaos during the martial law and impeachment hearing. So I think that will be something that is probably picked up. I mean, you would think China and the U.S. will still kind of be headlines for this, but I think that will get its due. Maybe of local interest, but that could be intriguing storyline to cover. I've seen it covered locally already, is just Gyeongju hosting this event in the first place, and there's already been discussions of is it behind on the preparations? Are the facilities adequate? There's only supposedly a couple of 5-star hotels in Gyeongju, and there's transportation questions, and that's something that I think is going to be an ongoing, maybe up to the point of hosting this story. And it's something obviously you think South Korea is well capable of pulling these sorts of things off, but a few outlets have already pointed to the World Scout Jamboree in 2023, the sort of disastrous hosting of that. So there's some question of, can South Korea pull this off? And I think related to that too is just this sense of what South Korea is trying to do to bring development, bring attention to regions other than Seoul, by hosting it in Gyeongju. And this is just such a major issue domestically, but has just many effects as the country continues to develop, that so much economic, political, cultural, everything power is focused in Seoul, and what that does to the rest of the country. So, that Gyeongju may help shine a light on that story as well.
Right, right. And this is something we'll probably cover some more ahead of the actual summit in Gyeongju later this year. All right, Thomas, I'm afraid that's all the time. Thank you so much for your time and your thoughts today. Professor Kim, thank you so much for your thought-provoking insights today. Right, and that is all for this edition of Press Perspective. Do join us again same time tomorrow.